We began with breaking news and a consequential day at the U.S. Supreme Court, where in minutes the justices will hear arguments involving President Trump's controversial executive order that would end birthright citizenship for the children of undocumented migrants. 3 federal judges have blocked Trump's order from proceeding, one calling it blatantly unconstitutional. At issue in today's case is whether any of those judges or any lower court judge has the authority to check the power of the presidency nationwide. We'll carry these arguments live. And as we wait for the arguments to begin, NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian is joining us outside the court. We also have a full slate of legal experts with us this morning. MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, former U.S. attorney, MSNBC contributor Chuck Rosenberg, professor of constitutional law at NYU Kenji Yoshino, and former Manhattan District Attorney, Assistant District Attorney, MSNBC legal analyst Catherine Christian. Ken, let me start there at the court. Walk us through how this is going to unfold.
Hey, good morning, Anna. Well, you're first going to hear from the Solicitor General, John Sauer, who, with his distinctive voice, who famously successfully argued that presidents are immune from criminal prosecution in that case. And he's now arguing that there should not be nationwide injunctions. We'll then hear from the Solicitor General of New Jersey, who has sued Donald Trump in this case, and then a lawyer for immigrant groups and others who are arguing that there should be a nationwide injunction in this case. And again, the issue here is not on the merits of birthright citizenship. Ultimately, that may end up in front of this court, and that's an important issue. The issue here, though, is equally important. It's this question of whether a single federal judge in a federal district in the United States can issue an order that binds the whole country. And this is happening all the time now, but it's a relatively modern artifact. As far back as the 1960s, it wasn't happening very much at all. It's really exploded in the Trump era as Donald Trump has used executive orders to try to make sweeping changes in American policy, some of which many people think are unconstitutional. So, look, there are sound arguments on both sides here. The idea of letting a blatantly unconstitutional order stand in one district while knocking it out in another district could cause confusion and chaos, and the law would be different until the Supreme Court ultimately decided it. At the same time, there's the question of, what gives one judge a power to bind the whole country? Is that really what the founders intended? Some of these justices have already signaled their intent. For example, Neil Gorsuch has been a skeptic of nationwide injunctions for a long time, but it's really anybody's guess how this is going to go. We'll be able to read a lot into how these arguments unfold this morning.
Ken, we can hear, but we can't see all of the action there at the Supreme Court this morning. You did a great job working through that. What is the scene there? Are people protesting about this case specifically?
Yeah, they are. It's a typically boisterous scene out in front of the Supreme Court. There are a group of people, some with microphones, as you can hear, many with signs, arguing in favor of birthright citizenship as a bedrock of the Constitution. And Donald Trump posted on Truth Social today against birthright citizenship. I think a lot of people don't understand that, again, that's really not the issue that the court is chewing on today and grappling with. It's a different, very important issue. But, of course, birthright citizenship is the backdrop, is the case that's bringing this other matter in front of them.
And the future for many millions of families hanging in the balance ultimately here. Lisa, let me ask you, what arguments are we expecting from each side? We know there'll be John Sauer representing the Trump administration arguing before the Supreme Court. And then there are a couple of lawyers who will argue separately with their arguments on behalf of the challengers.
Right. And in asking for a stay, Anna, the government has said in its papers that the, quote, usual stay factors apply. One of those factors, as everyone around the table knows, is that you show a likelihood of success on the merits. One of the disputes here, however, is what are the merits of this case? The government wants to define the merits as the permissibility of nationwide injunctions and limit the debate today to that issue alone. You should expect to hear for the respondents who are the plaintiffs in these cases, though, that the merits are really about the underlying unconstitutionality of the president's birthright citizenship executive order, which, as Ken just noted, would limit birthright citizenship and say that it doesn't belong to people who are accidentally or temporarily in this country, but rather only to children born of people who, for example, have permanent residence or domicile in the country. That's not historically how we've understood it. That's certainly not how people understand an 1898 precedent of this court called the Wong Kim Ark case. You should listen for those 3 words very carefully today, because if they go into that territory, we are going to be talking about the merits of birthright citizenship and what the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment provides.
What are you expecting from these arguments, Chuck, knowing what we know at this point?
What Lisa said. The narrow argument is about the propriety of nationwide injunctions, universal injunctions, sometimes also called non-party injunctions, the ability of one judge in one place to bind all parties in all places. That's the case. But Lisa's quite right. There is a backdrop. It's an important one. It's about birthright citizenship. The problem, Anna, is that if you have one judge in one place doing one thing and another judge in another place doing another thing, then you have a good bit of confusion and maybe even chaos when it comes to something like this. What about a child born in one jurisdiction that moves to another?
Exactly.
Right. So I'm expecting that the government will try and keep this narrowly focused on the nationwide injunction question. And I am expecting that the other side will try and imbue it with the underlying substantive question about birthright citizenship. As Lisa properly said, something we've commonly understood since 1898, arguably since 1868 when the 14th Amendment was ratified, to include the children of people in this country who are undocumented as our citizens.
And we'll circle back to the 14th Amendment, but as we get ready for this argument to begin, Kenji, when we're talking about nationwide or universal injunctions that are put in place by a district court judge, how uncommon or common is that?
They're increasingly common. So as Ken was saying, they used to be very, very uncommon. The Harvard Law Review has some data on this where it said even under George W. Bush, there were only 6 in his presidency. And then in the Obama era, there were 12. Right now, there are scores and scores of them. And part of this, as we'll hear the litigants say, is because, the number of executive orders has also skyrocketed. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, who started this phenomenon?
Yeah, the chicken or the egg.
Exactly.
Does the Constitution have anything to say about the power of those lower courts?
John Sauer will make arguments that, Article 3 sort of implies that district courts do not have this power because they're constrained. And one of the policy arguments, which could also be a constitutional argument, depending on how you look at it, is that the thing that these nationwide injunctions do is that they prohibit the cases from perking or percolating throughout the courts so that you get different decisions, so you get a robust kind of clash of ideas, the case or controversy requirement under Article 3 being satisfied in that way, and then it all funnels up to the Supreme Court. If you have one of these 94 districts around the country saying, we actually enjoin this, and an injunction is just an order saying you're prohibited from doing this, you're required to do this, if you have one of those saying that for the entire country, you don't get that kind of percolation. So I would listen for that argument as well.
Catherine, do you expect that the justices will ask questions of the lawyers on the constitutionality of the president's executive order to end birthright citizenship?
I hope so, because it'll be much more interesting and we'll get a sense of where the justices are. Because the justices, and we have the con law professor here, can ask whatever they want. It's their court. So we'll get a sense. Will Jackson start saying, now let's talk about this backdrop? Will Alito say, let's talk about the backdrop, and get a sense of where they are? Because this issue, birthright citizenship, is going to be before the Supreme Court. And so we might get a preview of where they will land today.
Which justices will you specifically be watching?
Jackson and Alito.
Those two.
And also,
you see them as
Gorsuch,
like the two
as Gorsuch
extreme
said,
sides?
as Ken said, Gorsuch has already basically said he's against nationwide injunctions, or at least he's implied that. But it'll be interesting. And I'm using them because they're sort of, and Kagan, I'm talking about, I hate to go left versus right, but Jackson, Kagan, Alito, Kavanaugh, and also, quite frankly, Amy Barrett, Justice Barrett, because she sort of seems to be, so far, kind of in the middle, though more to the right. So I'm going to be interested to see what questions they ask. Now, we might be surprised that they'll just stick to the nationwide injunction.
I mean, I think a lot of people watching this are saying, why wouldn't they, if they're going to have to rule at some point on the merits of this case, the heart of the case over birthright citizenship, why wouldn't they rule on that or take that on in this particular time, in this juncture?
And they well may, but I mean, this is coming to them on such a kind of expedited basis under an emergency appeal under the so-called shadow docket. I mean, they set this argument long after oral arguments for the term had concluded, so they may actually want a little bit more time and consideration of this. Another thing that I will say, off of the last point that was just made, is that I want to note that the justices actually converge on the injunction issue, but they diverge sharply on the birthright citizenship issue.
Oh, really?
So it's interesting that, even Elena Kagan has said it seems kind of crazy that, one judge, would be able to set down this injunction that would bind the entire country. So it's not just Neil Gorsuch and Sam Alito and Justice Thomas who are complaining about this. It's also Justice Kagan. So look for some alignment of strange bedfellows across party lines on that one. When you shift over to the merits issue, as Lisa was saying, on the birthright citizenship, then the daggers come out and that breaks really sharply on partisan lines.